glad to sit down with you, Justin, and talk about things that matter to the people of Ontario.
It's also an opportunity for us to dig into a broad range of issues that matter to Ontarians, and I very much look forward to our conversations this afternoon and tomorrow.
Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau met in Montreal earlier this afternoon. As you just saw, the Ontario Premier and the Prime Minister discussed issues affecting Ontario ahead of tomorrow's First Ministers meeting, where the pair will be joined by the rest of the country's premiers. Several provincial leaders are upset with the way the agenda for the meeting is shaping up. Doug Ford has even threatened to walk away if his concerns aren't addressed. So what does Ontario want to discuss? Todd Smith is Ontario's Minister of Economic Development, and he joins us now from Queen's Park. Hi, Minister Smith. Thanks for coming back on the show. Nice to see you.
Hi, Vashi.
So the Premier was threatening earlier today to walk out of the meeting if his conditions weren't met. He said he would decide after meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau. Will Premier Ford be at the meeting tomorrow?
All I'm hearing is that they did have a positive and productive meeting at their session this afternoon, and I'm not exactly sure if he convinced the Prime Minister that he should be changing the agenda tomorrow to talk about what actually matters to the provinces. So we're still waiting to find out whether or not the Prime Minister has changed the agenda or the federal government has changed the agenda to at least hear from provinces that have a lot of concerns that they want to have dealt with their federal cousins.
What would walking out of that meeting actually accomplish, though? Don't you have a more amplified and important voice if you actually are at the table?
Well, only if you're actually able to talk about the subjects that matter. I think going into today, what we heard was that we were going to be talked to by a number of Liberal ministers federally, and that they were going to take up most of the time talking about what they wanted to talk about and not hearing from the provinces about what actually matters to the people in the individual provinces. So in the case of Ontario, we want to be talking about auto manufacturing and manufacturing in general and auto parts and those important things, especially in the light of what happened to General Motors in Oshawa last week. We also want to be talking about the carbon tax and ensuring that we don't have another carbon tax imposed on us after we went to extraordinary lengths to get rid of a carbon tax, the cap and trade system that was in place here in Ontario. So, we're doing everything that we can to try and get the important matters on the agenda, because we've heard from our counterparts in provinces across Canada that what was on the agenda was not going to suit their needs or what they want to talk about.
To be fair, though, you're talking about jobs and manufacturing. I looked at the draft agenda. There was an hour devoted just to jobs. I spoke with Minister Catherine McKenna yesterday, and she was only going to talk for 5 minutes. She was open to talking about Bill C-69, for example, the carbon issues. There was never an indication from either her or the Prime Minister that what the premiers want to talk about wouldn't be talked about. So what is really at the heart of, is this a political move more on your government's part?
No. There is concern from all of the provinces about the agenda, and we heard that from all of the premiers who are in attendance, that they did have concerns about the agenda that was coming forward, that the needs that they have in their individual provinces and now collective provinces when it comes to the carbon tax specifically weren't going to be dealt with in a way that they could voice their concerns. Now, maybe the meeting this afternoon between Premier Ford and Prime Minister Trudeau has solved some of the issues around the agenda, and we're waiting to find out if indeed the agenda will be changed. And there will be more of an opportunity for the premiers to exercise their right to speak and voice concerns. I know that Premier Ford is meeting right now, I believe, with Premier Scott Moe from Saskatchewan and the new Premier in New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs, to talk about some mutual interests there, most notably probably the carbon tax issue. And you can see the opposition to the federal carbon tax mounting. So I know that they have meetings as well later tonight or early tomorrow with the other premiers from across Canada to discuss issues, but we really want to be able to talk to the feds about the issues that we're having in individual provinces. Obviously, the oil crisis out west is a big issue, and we've taken steps in our fall economic statement, which just passed moments ago here in the legislature in Ontario, to ensure that we don't step in the way of any kind of pipelines that would be built across Canada.
Minister McKenna, I believe, was supposed to meet with Minister Phillips to talk about Minister Phillips' request to have the climate plan that your government announced recently sort of satisfy the federal conditions. Did you receive an answer on that?
I haven't talked to Minister Phillips about that. I'm not exactly sure. I hope it has, because I think it's a very, very valid plan, given the fact that Ontario is leading the way when it comes to the elimination of greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario and dealing with the climate situation. Ontario
leading the way in what capacity, Minister?
By reducing greenhouse gas emissions and being on the road to meeting the targets that were set out in the Paris Accord. Yeah, well, some of it was, and it came at great cost, obviously, to Ontario's competitiveness, and that's why we're taking steps to ensure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that Ontario is open for business. You've heard it time and time again. Just today, I introduced another piece of legislation aimed at reducing red tape in the province to make businesses more competitive. It's called the Restoring Ontario's Competitiveness Bill, and it deals with over 30 new pieces of regulation being removed and across 12 different ministries. So we're doing everything we can here in Ontario to make Ontario a competitive jurisdiction, not just across Canada, but around the world, and especially in dealing with our neighboring states just south of us.
I want to pick up on that idea of being open for business. What does the U.S. ruling against a proposed Hydro One purchase of American business Avista say about that slogan?
Well, I think it says that the Ontario government is actually committed to ensuring that we get electricity prices coming down. It's the largest issue that we've heard from businesses right across Ontario is the Liberal plan that was put in place drove electricity prices to some of the highest in North America, especially for business. And we've had a real sigh of relief from the business community since we've been elected in June because of some of the steps that we've been taking to ensure that Hydro One actually understands that they have to be responsible to the people here in Ontario first, and that includes not just our residential customers, who in many cases were forced to choose between heating and eating in their homes, but our business community, which has just been nailed by the global adjustment and the industrial cost of electricity here, especially compared with our neighbors to the south, which are offering reduced prices of electricity, partly because we're paying them at times to take the electricity off our hands.
But Minister, the decision that was released by the regulator is going to cost taxpayers over at least $103 million. They specifically highlighted your government's interference in getting rid of Hydro One's CEO as significant and a factor in what making this decision. You know, I mean, how is that open for business?
But Vashi, what was happening in the electricity sector in Ontario prior to us taking government was more and more and more expensive, subsidized, renewable energy projects that were coming on board. We're taking a different approach.
So you got rid of the CEO and it's $100 million to taxpayers?
No, we're ensuring that we're making big changes. Listen, we canceled 790 renewable energy projects that were going to continue to drive up the cost of electricity by another $800 million. These are the kinds of decisions that the Liberals were making, and at the same time, subsidizing electricity rates south of the border.
So this cost is acceptable to you, Minister? There's $103 million taxpayers will be paying now, at least, is acceptable to you?
We needed to send a message to Hydro One that their most important interest had to be the customers here in Ontario and not the shareholders at Hydro One. And I think that's the message that the Premier and our Minister of Energy, Greg Rickford, sent very early on in our government's taking over here in Ontario. The message that we sent to Hydro One was that we have to do something about the soaring cost of electricity. If this is the aftermath of that, well, that's unfortunate, but what I can tell you is that it's part of our action that we're taking to reduce the cost of electricity and making businesses competitive in Ontario.
Can taxpayers expect to pay more for decisions like that?
No, well, full sum. Electricity customers in Ontario are going to see lower electricity prices because of the steps that we're making here in Ontario and taking here in Ontario.
All right, thank you so much, Minister Smith. Really appreciate your time.
Okay, Vashi.